The book of First Chronicles, the Davidic line. In the genealogies and victories of David, God's eternal promise to Israel shines through. From the first man to the greatest king, the story of God's faithfulness unfolds, leading to the day when his presence will dwell in the temple and his promises will be fulfilled through David's line. As the narrative of 1 and 2 Kings concludes with the fall of Israel and Judah, the story appears to be one of utter defeat. However, the books of 1 and 2 Chronicles offer a different perspective, a retelling of Israel's history, but with a renewed focus on hope, covenant, and the promises of God. Written for a post-exilic community returning from Babylon, 1 Chronicles emphasizes the Davidic line and God's enduring commitment to his people, even in the face of their failures. Through genealogies and the story of David's reign, the book traces God's faithfulness to his covenant with Israel, pointing to a future restoration. Overview. First Chronicles revisits the history of Israel, focusing on David's lineage and reign. Unlike the accounts in 1 and 2 Samuel and 1 Kings, which include many of David's personal struggles and failures, 1 Chronicles highlights David's role as the chosen king who establishes Israel as a powerful nation. The emphasis is on God's eternal covenant with David, which promises that his line will continue forever, ultimately culminating in the Messiah. The genealogies serve as a reminder that God's plan has been in motion since the beginning, through every generation, and will not be thwarted. The book presents David as a man after God's own heart, who, despite his imperfections, is used by God to prepare Israel for its most significant spiritual milestone, the building of the temple. Key events in the book of First Chronicles. 1. The genealogies, connecting Israel to its past. 1 Chronicles opens with extensive genealogies, tracing Israel's history from Adam to the 12 tribes, focusing especially on the line of David. These genealogies are more than just a list of names. They connect the exiled community to their heritage, reminding them of their identity as God's chosen people. Each name represents a link in the chain of God's promise, showing that despite their past failures, Israel's story is far from over. These genealogies also emphasize the continuity of God's covenant with Israel. From Adam through Abraham and finally to David, the promise of a king from David's line shines through, giving hope to a people who have experienced exile and destruction. 2. David's reign, a nation united. The heart of First Chronicles focuses on David's reign, presenting him as the ideal king who unites Israel and establishes Jerusalem as the center of worship. David's military victories are recounted, showcasing how God's favor and guidance lead Israel to triumph over its enemies. However, the chronicler omits some of the more difficult moments in David's life, such as his sin with Bathsheba, focusing instead on his role as a king who loves God and seeks to build a nation dedicated to worshiping him. David's reign is seen as a model of what it looks like when a king leads with a heart after God. 3. Preparations for the temple, a vision for worship. One of the most important themes in First Chronicles is David's preparation for the building of the temple. Though David is not permitted to build the temple himself because of his history as a warrior, he takes significant steps to ensure that his son Solomon will be able to carry out this monumental task. David gathers materials, organizes the Levites and priests, and provides detailed plans for the temple's construction. His passion for the temple reflects his deep desire for God's presence to dwell among his people in a permanent and sacred place. This preparation underscores the central role that worship and the temple will play in the life of Israel and in the legacy of David's reign. 4. David's final words and legacy. The book concludes with David's final instructions to Solomon and the leaders of Israel, emphasizing the importance of obedience to God's commands and devotion to temple worship. David's final words are a reminder of the covenant promise, that through his line, Israel's future king would come, and the temple would be the center of God's presence among his people. David's legacy is not just in his military conquests or political achievements, but in his heart for God, and his role in establishing a foundation for future worship. The Book of Second Chronicles, the Temple and the Kings. The temple stood as a beacon, but when kings turned away from worship, the light of the kingdom dimmed. From Solomon's golden reign to the ashes of Jerusalem's destruction, the story of the kings reminds us that true strength lies not in power or wealth, but in faithfulness to God. While First Chronicles focuses on the rise of David and his preparations for the temple, Second Chronicles continues the story, focusing on the reign of Solomon, the building of the temple, and the long succession of kings who follow. As the narrative moves through the generations of Judah's kings, the central question is this: will the kings remain faithful to the covenant and uphold the worship of God in the temple, or will they turn away, leading the nation into darkness? 2. Chronicles chronicles the reign of Solomon and the kings of Judah, with a particular focus on the role of the temple and worship in Israel's national life. Solomon's reign is marked by wisdom, wealth, and the building of the glorious temple in Jerusalem. But the book also recounts the decline that follows when subsequent kings turn away from God. The temple, built as a place for God's presence, stands as both a symbol of hope and a warning. When kings and the people honor God, the kingdom thrives, but when they forsake Him, the kingdom falls into ruin. The book ends with the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, the exile of the people to Babylon, and a glimmer of hope for future restoration. Through it all, the temple remains at the heart of the story, representing the spiritual health of the nation. Key events in the book of Second Chronicles. 1. The reign of Solomon, wisdom and worship. The early chapters of 2 Chronicles are devoted to Solomon's reign, emphasizing his wisdom, wealth, and most importantly, the construction of the temple. Solomon's request for wisdom, granted by God, leads to an era of unprecedented prosperity and peace for Israel. The temple Solomon builds is described in great detail, reflecting its importance as the dwelling place of God's presence among His people. Solomon's dedication of the temple is one of the high points in Israel's history. As he prays, fire comes down from heaven, and the glory of the Lord fills the temple, signifying God's approval. Solomon's prayer acknowledges the greatness of God and the need for the people to remain faithful to His commands. However, Solomon's later years are marked by compromises and idolatry, foreshadowing the struggles that will plague future kings. 2. The kings of Judah, faithfulness and failure. After Solomon's death, the kingdom divides, but 2 Chronicles focuses on the southern kingdom of Judah and its kings. The narrative highlights both the righteous kings who lead the people back to God and the wicked kings who lead them astray. Kings like Hezekiah and Josiah stand out as examples of faithfulness, initiating reforms and restoring proper worship in the temple. Hezekiah faces the threat of the Assyrian army and responds with faith, seeking God's deliverance, which comes in the form of a miraculous defeat of the Assyrians. Hezekiah also cleanses the temple and reestablishes the Passover, leading the people in spiritual renewal. Josiah, similarly, brings about major reforms after discovering the Book of the Law in the temple. His passion for God's word leads to the destruction of idols and the restoration of worship. However, even these moments of revival cannot prevent the overall decline of the nation, as later kings abandon the covenant and fall into idolatry. 3. The decline and fall, exile and destruction. As the kings of Judah increasingly turn away from God, the kingdom falls into political and spiritual decline. The people forsake the temple, worship idols, and ignore the warnings of the prophets. Finally, God's judgment comes upon Judah. The Babylonians, led by Nebuchadnezzar, invade, destroying Jerusalem and the temple, and carrying the people into exile in Babylon. The destruction of the temple is a devastating blow, symbolizing the breaking of the covenant and the loss of God's presence among His people. The book ends on a tragic note, but not without hope. The final verses point to the decree of Cyrus the Great, allowing the exiles to return to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple, signaling the beginning of restoration. 1. Chronicles and 2 Chronicles retell the story of Israel's history with a focus on the Davidic line and the central role of the temple in the life of the nation. While 1 Chronicles celebrates the reign of David and his preparation for the temple, 2 Chronicles shows how the fortunes of the kingdom rise and fall based on the faithfulness of its kings to God's covenant. These books serve as both a reminder and a warning to the post-exilic community. God's promises to David remain, but the people must remain faithful to their covenant with him. The temple, though destroyed, will be rebuilt, and the hope of a future king from David's line remains alive. Chronicles looks back at Israel's past with an eye toward the future, a future where worship, covenant, and the presence of God remain central to the life of his people.